Back to the Future is one of, if not my favorite movie of all time. It is truly an almost perfect script, accompanied by impressive effects, compelling characters, groundbreaking performances, and an amazing musical score. There's a reason this movie has stood the test of time, still finding itself in the hearts of many nearly 40 years later. Which of course is why Hollywood has spent the last 30 years trying to reboot the franchise with either a remake or fourth entry in the franchise. However, I think we have the only reboot we'll ever need. If you have somehow never heard of Back to the Future, here's a quick summary. Written by Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, the first film follows 17-year-old Marty McFly as he accidentally travels back to 1955 using a time-traveling DeLorean built by the genius Doc Brown. While in the 1950s, Marty accidentally interrupts his parents from meeting, endangering his own existence. Through some hijinks, Doc and Marty must now get his parents back together and fix the DeLorean before it's too late. The film was a huge success and is still iconic to this day. In fact, it was so successful that Gale and Zemeckis continued the story in 2 sequels. After several more trips to the future and past, the story is brought to a natural conclusion in the 3rd film. At that point, Zemeckis and Gale said that they would not make a 4th film. The story was over, and they wouldn't extend it beyond the perfect story they had already told. But did that stop Hollywood from trying? Of course not. For years, Zemeckis and Gale have been asked if they would come back for a 4th. Of course, there was the TV show and the video game, but those have always been considered loose canon at best. Currently, Zemeckis is the rights owner of Back to the Future and has said repeatedly he would never let a Back to the Future 4 be made unless it was truly necessary. Gale has always said he would only let a 4th film happen if the original cast and crew behind the trilogy could return. So why does Hollywood want to make another Back to the Future so badly? Money. It's because of money. Currently, Hollywood is suffering from a bit of a nostalgia crisis. While there are plenty of unique and original ideas, it's hard to ignore the huge amount of nostalgia with remakes or reboots of classic franchises like Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, Star Trek, and Ghostbusters. Now, I'm not totally condemning reboots and remakes. There can be good reboots of classic franchises that introduce the story to an all-new audience. However, I have a hard time believing a 4th Back to the Future or a remake would warrant its own existence. Plus, if you don't know, Zemeckis and Gale have already remade and rebooted Back to the Future in the best and only way possible. If the title of this video and the musical itself wasn't a clear enough answer, Back to the Future the Musical is a musical theater adaptation of the first film in the franchise. Written by Bob Gale with music and lyrics by Alan Silvestri and Glenn Ballard. Back to the Future the Musical received Zemeckis' blessing in 2012. Over the next 8 years, Gale, Silvestri, and Ballard worked hard to perfect the adaptation of the first film for the theater stage. In February 2020, the musical made its debut in Manchester, England, followed by its Broadway debut in June 2023. Now you might be saying, wait, didn't Zemeckis and Gale refuse to reboot the franchise with a remake or 4th entry? Which you would be correct, they still stand by that. However, the musical is an all-new medium for the franchise, leaving the silver screen and jumping onto a stage near you. With 26 musical numbers, this is a totally new experience for new and old fans of the story. Because that's what an adaptation should be, a new experience of a classic story that validates its need for existence, but does not serve as a replacement of the original media. The show is incredibly impressive, managing to blend the classic script from the original 1985 film with new updated humor, musical numbers, and an increased runtime. Using screens, lighting, and impressive sets, the musical manages to capture the atmosphere of 1955 and 1985 perfectly on the stage. I strongly urge you to go see it for yourself if you haven't already. The show is currently on its North American tour and may be visiting a city near you. At this point, I've said what I can about the musical without spoiling anything. From here on out, I will be talking about spoilers regarding the story, music, and overall presentation of the show. If you haven't seen the show yet, I strongly recommend you leave for now, save the surprises for your first viewing, then come back to discuss what did or did not work for you. Additionally, obviously there isn't much footage to use as reference for the show. as there is no pro shoot and the show is currently still on Broadway and touring. Because of this, we're going to have to use our imaginations here. For this video, I will be using the limited footage available, the original films, and some outside performances as visuals. Alright, with that warning, let's get into the big changes and how this musical works as a perfect adaptation of Back to the Future. I mentioned earlier that I think Back to the Future has a perfect script and screenplay, so that leaves a huge pressure on anyone who dares to change it. However, changes have to be made. A film has the ability to reshoot multiple times, add visual effects in post, and change camera angles and locations between cuts. Things a live theater performance doesn't leave room for. Instead, they have to work with dynamic lighting, sets, and eccentric actors to truly sell the energy of the film. Because of that, they must make small changes to the story in order to keep it fresh and make it work on stage. The biggest change you'll notice from the start of the musical is that the DeLorean time machine is now voice activated. It can now only be started and have the destination set by Doc Brown. Funnily enough, in the animated series, Doc rebuilds the time machine, adding the voice activation feature, making this potentially a fun reference to that. At first, I hesitated at this change in the musical, wondering why they would limit the time machine so much in this version of the story. However, as the story plays out, you'll see that it's to simplify parts of the story and keep them from dragging on in the show. For example, in the finale of the movie, Marty makes it back to 1985 and then races back to the newly named Lone Pine Mall to save the doc. In the movie, this is just done with a few simple scene transitions and the magic of editing. Again, something you can't do on stage during a Broadway musical. Instead, Marty's return to 1985 is simplified. Marty arrives in 1985 in Town Square, but he's unable to get the car started again, seeing as Doc isn't with him, making it impossible for him to make it to the mall on time. Luckily for him, Doc enters from offstage, alive and well, with the remark that he would know exactly when and where Marty would arrive, thanks to their weather experiment in 1955. This keeps the scene the same, with Marty arriving in 1985 and finding the Doc alive, but it eliminates the need for another set/location change on stage. I actually found it a clever workaround, even though I was sad to see the Lone Pine gag missing from the musical.
Old man Peabody owned all of this. He had this crazy idea about breeding pine trees.
Speaking of their experiment at the mall, Doc's death in the initial time travel experiment is changed. As you might remember, in the movie Einstein, Doc's dog becomes the world's first time traveler. Here, it's Doc, most likely having to find a way to make an Einstein puppet or to get him out of the DeLorean in time for the actors to get in. I'm cool with it because it leads to possibly my favorite musical number of the show. It works, but more on that later. Additionally, we all know that the first iteration of the DeLorean runs on plutonium, which Doc hires Libyan terrorists to steal. While I said the first film has a perfect script, I will admit the Libyan terrorist bit does not age well, and is actually pretty insensitive. Instead, the musical cuts the terrorist altogether, just vaguely alluding to how Doc got his hands on the plutonium. Rather than being gunned down by cultural stereotypes, he instead dies from radiation poisoning, seeing as his hazmat suit isn't lead-lined enough. It's another clever workaround that is honestly kind of morbid and darker than Doc's original demise. During the bit, Doc's actor literally rips their shirt open, and underneath they're wearing a glow-in-the-dark skeleton shirt, and the idea of that is haunting. We all know how Marty's parents met, right? Lorraine's father runs George over after he falls from a tree while peeping at Lorraine. Well, here in the musical, it's simplified to George falling out of the tree and that's it. You might be wondering, why such a seemingly insignificant change? Well, it's actually to avoid having any other cars besides the DeLorean in the show. You see, in the musical, the only car we physically see is the DeLorean. All other vehicles in the show are just implied, or you might just see a car seat. It gives the DeLorean more weight and makes it more special when it flies on stage. While I've talked about things they've taken away, they actually added something from the second movie to this version of the story. The scene where Biff asks Lorraine to the dance in part 2 is now included here. Adding this in gives the opportunity for another great musical number for Biff, Teach Him a Lesson. It also helps the musical transition Biff to his role in the third act a bit easier. Not a necessary change, but a neat inclusion of something from the second movie. One big change that had me hesitant at first was the absence of the big town square chase between Biff and Marty. Instead, they combine the scene with the lunchroom sequence from the movie, where Biff and Marty confront each other. Ultimately, I believe this is to eliminate the need to continuously change sets. Instead, Biff and the bullies chase Marty and George around the high school, making for some very fun set pieces we'll touch on later. Finally, another big change, almost next to the DeLorean, is the ending. If you've made it this far in the video, you know how Back to the Future ends by now. Marty arrives back home to find his life has changed for the better. His siblings have successful careers, and his once sniveling father is now a successful, confident author. It's a great ending to the film, but not exactly a showy one. It would make for a very lackluster ending to a stage show. Instead, when Marty arrives back in Town Square, 1985, he finds himself in the middle of George McFly Day, a day dedicated to celebrating the town's famous award-winning author. During a speech, George reveals his new book, Back to the Future 4, making a quick jab at how he refuses to sell the film rights because Hollywood will just mess it up. And to top the whole celebration off, George calls his son, Marty McFly, up to the stage to perform with his band, the Pinheads, during which they are joined by the entire cast in a closing number of The Power of Love. It's a great and exciting way to bring the musical to a close, and also gives a resolution to Marty's band, which we see at the start of the movie and show. Like I said, the original ending is perfect, but this ending gives the cast one last chance to show their stuff. Additionally, Jennifer does not get in the DeLorean with Doc and Marty at the end of the musical. Originally, I just wrote this up to there's not enough room for 3 people in the prop, there's barely room for 2. However, in my research for this video, I discovered that Robert Zemeckis has actually said in hindsight he would not put Jennifer in the car at the end of the first movie. He said he did it as a joke, seeing as there was no plan for a sequel. He just thought it was silly for all 3 of them to pack into this flying car. So you can see this change as him taking the opportunity to redo the scene and not put Jennifer in the car. And with that, we get to obviously the biggest change of them all, the music. I cannot even fathom having the challenge of creating music for this show. One might argue that adding music to something that already exists can make it challenging to write music that is meaningful and good. I'm looking at you, mean girls. It can be hard to get creative when you're limited to the already existing story and attitude around the original film. Luckily for them, Back to the Future has a banging soundtrack that gives them a great jumping off point. It's Only a Matter of Time is the opening number, and what better way to open than with the original Back to the Future theme. The tune, It's Only a Matter of Time, is sung to the iconic theme that everyone has heard before. Throughout the song, Marty sings about his goals for a better future, as well as introducing us to a few of the supporting cast. The opening number of the musical is meant to grab the audience's attention right from the start. It's an earworm that I still find myself humming to myself daily. Marty's audition with the Pinheads is turned into a musical number featuring The Power of Love and going into the incredibly short Got No Future. It's only just over a minute long and isn't anything too special. Not every song in this show is going to be a banger. I understand why it needs to be there though. How could you not include the musical audition from the original film in this new adaptation? Plus, it clearly sets up Marty's self-doubt and inner conflict, which we will see reflected later in his own father. Wherever We're Going is a duet sung by Marty and Jennifer in front of the clock tower. This is of course the scene where Jennifer and Marty get the flyer to save the clock tower. Frankly, this is probably one of my least listened to songs on the track. Its purpose here is to establish Marty and Jennifer's relationship and aspirations. Marty sings about his doubts, while Jennifer props him back up and rebuilds his confidence. And let's be honest, it's more than Jennifer has to do in the original film. Outside of writing down her phone number, she's absent from the first film and has a much bigger role in the second film. Plus, this gets expanded upon in another duet between the two later. Hello, is anybody home? Introduces us to the other members of the McFly family. Each member gets a verse where they drop their character traits and some essential exposition, such as how George and Lorraine met. The set and the background dance moves are the highlight of this sequence. Seeing the other actors act out their morning routine in exaggerated movements, such as playing catch with the milk or eating oversized pieces of cereal. Meanwhile, the house shifts and moves all around them. Also, we need this musical number to establish all the McFlys in present day, so that when their characters change by the end, we know what's different. Arguably the biggest musical number of the show, It Works, is the highlight of the entire night. This song is sung by Doc Brown and takes the place of the DeLorean's initial time travel test, during which Doc explains how the time machine works and the origin of the flux capacitor. Traditionally, musical songs are used to either transition scenes or spout exposition, so what better way to explain how the time machine works than through song? It's a huge musical number with lots of stage work as Doc and Marty dance around the DeLorean on stage and eventually become accompanied by a group of background dancers. The dancers also come with a cute fourth wall break.
Hey Doc, yeah! Who are the girls? I don't know! They just show up every time I start singing!
This idea of Doc being able to break the fourth wall / having medium awareness will recur throughout the show. A fun addition when performing in front of a live audience. There's a reason that this is the song the show uses for all its marketing. Following Marty's 88-mile-per-hour trip to 1955, we find ourselves in the next musical number, Cake. This serves as a way for the musical to set the scene of 1955 America. While the movie could do that through sets and props, you can't be that subtle on the theater stage. Subtlety is difficult in the theater because not all seats in every theater can see every part of the stage. That's why they explain the 1955 setting through this song instead. And in this musical number, they point out all the major issues and talking points from the 1950s, like segregation, women's societal expectations, and advertisements of miracle medicines and cigarettes. Personally, I do think it goes on for a bit too long, but I understand the need for it. Next up is another song you might question its inclusion. Earlier in the show and movie, it's noted that Mayor Goldie started off by sweeping the floors at the local diner. So when Marty enters the diner, who does he meet but none other than Goldie Wilson? Here, Wilson sings his musical number, Gotta Start Somewhere. I'll admit, this song could easily be cut from the show. It doesn't progress the plot or deliver any necessary exposition. That being said, the performance from Goldie's actor during my personal experience is a standout in the show. Another song I feel could have been cut is George's solo, My Myopia. This is a song George sings while peeping on Lorraine before he falls out of the tree. It's meant to establish George as the shy nerd we know who's comfortable where he is in life, like we see in the future, but it goes on for far too long. I think this song would be okay if it was just the first half. Additionally, George being nerdy was already established with him reading a comic book in the diner when he's confronted by Biff. I think we could have just had him fall out of the tree when spotted by Marty like in the movie without this musical number, or again, by shortening it. Plus, it's followed by one of my favorite musical numbers in the show, Pretty Baby, sung by Lorraine. It is unfortunately about her falling in love with Marty when he wakes up in her house. It's a very fun little love song that has wormed its way into my ear after the show. On top of the music, the scene is another one of those instances where the performances and stage work add to the scene. As we all know, Calvin Klein, I mean Marty, is in his underwear during this scene. I fully expected them to keep Marty in bed and not show anything, only imply it. However, during the song, Marty is stumbling over furniture and getting the blanket caught on props while trying to avoid Lorraine's advances. Eventually, to my surprise, Marty does drop the blanket, revealing he is in fact in his underwear to the crowd. It makes for a fun sequence set to a nice 1950s love track. Speaking of Marty's current predicament, he and Doc attempt to figure out how to fix the DeLorean in Future Boy. At the start of the song, Marty is in despair, believing he'll never get home. However, the song picks up tempo as Doc and Marty piece together that they can use the lightning from the clock tower to power up the capacitor. Doc and Marty are joined again by Doc's backup singers, where they confidently come to the conclusion they're gonna get Marty back to the future. Frankly, I thought this song was going to be the Act 1 closer. It has a big flashy ending with the backup dancers and confidently introduces the solution to our problem, which the characters will then seek out in Act 2. However, Act 1 has one last, potentially flashier performance. Something About That Boy is our Act 1 closer, where we see Biff and Lorraine singing about Marty. While Lorraine is falling for him, Biff sings about his anger and frustration with Marty. At first I thought this was a strange song to end Act 1. It's a good song, but not as big and flashy musically as Future Boy. However, where the sequence stands out is in the stage work and choreography. You see, this musical number takes the place of the town square chase from the movie. Instead, Biff and his boys chase Marty and George around the high school with constantly shifting sets as the actors run on and off stage. The sets shift and change, going from a cafeteria with tables to a locker room with lockers shifting and having hidden doors that allow actors to pop in and out of them with ease. With that comes the very funny joke in which Biff discovers Principal Strickland smoking in one of the lockers. It got a good chuckle out of my crowd. Instead of the manure truck, we instead have Marty and Biff do a bit of a lightsaber fight on top of the lockers, ultimately landing Biff in the dirty laundry. While I was sad that we didn't get the manure truck and town square, the chase around the shifting school is a great use of the stage in a live performance, and a fun way to end Act 1. 21st Century is another solo for Doc that welcomes the audience back from intermission. It's a totally original sequence to the musical that could have only been added to the story with present-day hindsight. During the song, Doc is flanked by his backup dancers again and sings about his expectations of the 21st century, during which he sings about things like universal health care, no more world hunger, and the end of capitalism, all things that totally definitely happened with the 21st century. It's a funny song that's necessary to pump the audience back up after the intermission. It also includes some fun electronic dance music where the actor for Doc and his backup dancers get to show off. I also need them to sell that chair that he sits in at the end, the one with the flux capacitor on it. Next up is my favorite song and sequence in the show, Put Your Mind to It. This takes the place of the scene where Marty informs George of his plan to get Lorraine to choose George over him. Of course, George doubts himself and is persistent he can't do it, to which Marty has to push him with the advice Doc gave Marty in 1985.
Oh, you make it sound so easy. I wish I wasn't so scared.
George, there's nothing to be scared of. All it takes is a little self-confidence. You know, if you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
It's a really fun dance sequence where we see Marty showing George how to be cool and why George ultimately fails at that until the end. I feel what really makes this work are the two actors portraying these roles. While Marty moves fluently and with style, George is stiff and clumsy, making for a fun contrast on stage. It's also a nice father-son bonding moment for the two, and we'll see that it comes back at the end when George quotes Marty's own advice back to him at the celebration. For the Dreamers is Doc's third and slower solo, where he reminisces on the fact that he knows he'll be successful in the future. Currently, 1955 Doc is seen as an outcast in town, and we see nothing he builds works until now. So here we get a moment for him to reflect on his self-doubt, how he will succeed, and to never give up on his dreams. I will admit it is a bit slow for the point we are at in the story, but it gives Doc one last musical number before we reach the end of the show. Teach Him a Lesson is Biff's solo after he fails to convince Lorraine to go to the dance with him. It comes very late in the show, but you can't not give the villain in your musical a song. The villain songs are usually everybody's favorite. While this one might not be an all-timer, it's a perfect song for Biff. We all know Biff's iconic line,
"So why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?"
Throughout the movies, it's proven again and again that Biff never gets idioms correct.
That's about as funny as a screen door on a battleship.
Screen door on a submarine, you dork.
So perfectly translated here, we see Biff get multiple idioms and lines incorrect in his own song, where his lackeys then have to constantly correct the lyrics as he sings them. It's a fun song that isn't necessary, but very clearly explains Biff and what his deal is for new audience members. The Letter / It's Only a Matter of Time reprise is set when Marty writes his letter for Doc to warn him about his death, during which he begins to doubt himself and he ends up sharing a duet with Jennifer in his mind. Frankly, this is probably the weakest and most unnecessary musical number, and the one I personally listen to the least. It feels as though it only exists to give Jennifer's actor something to do, since Jennifer really isn't in the first movie. It could 100% be removed and nothing would be changed. Then, at the dance, we have 3 different songs, of which 2 are from the movie. Deep Divin' is a song that exists to establish the setting of the dance. Earth Angel plays out the same as it does in the movie. It's George and Lorraine's first dance, with the only addition being that George and Lorraine start singing along to the song after their kiss, which is a cute addition. Johnny Be Good also plays out the exact same way as it does in the movie. Sometimes the actors portraying Marty even encourage the crowd to say the final line with them.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
Finally, the last 2 songs, The Power of Love and Back in Time, serve as the finale of the show, after Marty makes it back to 1985. When Marty returns, we learn that his band is actually successful in this new timeline, and they perform The Power of Love, with various members of the cast joining in before Doc interrupts to zip Marty and him off to the future, in a very impressive effect we'll talk about in a moment. The screen drops with a big "The End" on it, but we're not done. Then, the curtains rise again. Doc and Marty sing Back in Time as everyone takes their bows before the curtain drops one last time with a familiar message to the crowd. So that is all the music in the show. As I said before, I do not pity the people who had to write these songs and figure out how to put them in the already existing storyline of Back to the Future. Are they all great? No. But I do think there's something to enjoy or an importance to most of them. Additionally, they give the actors and set designers a chance to show off. Ultimately, sometimes the music isn't great, but it's about putting on a show for the theater that really makes them shine. Of course, none of the music or story changes come together without the presentation of it all. They had to craft these iconic settings and props from the films to work on the Broadway stage. If you've forgotten, these are incredibly visual effects heavy films, so it's no surprise that the show is also very effects heavy. Here the show utilizes lighting, digital screens, and the sets themselves, with the crowning jewel of the DeLorean and actors to bring it all together in a beautiful presentation on the stage. In the movies, there are tons of fire, smoke, and electricity flying everywhere as the characters travel through time and conduct various experiments. In the show, these are pulled off mostly through lights and fog machines. For example, the iconic fire strips left by the DeLorean are lights laid on the stage floor with some possible projection assistance and a smoke machine. The lightning is provided by the screens, which we'll talk about later, and some additional lights that are attached to the edges of the stage. Is it flawless? No, but there is an expectation for the suspension of disbelief when you see a Broadway show, and I think it works. Additionally, I've seen some conflicting reports that there is maybe more pyrotechnics in the Broadway show versus a larger reliance on lights for the tour. Which makes sense. I can't travel across the country setting every theater on fire. The biggest and most impressive effect in the entire show are the multiple digital projection screens that are used throughout. On these screens, they can project various images to enhance a scene. For example, when the characters are in town square, a screen is used in the background to project the clock tower and some of the surrounding buildings to expand the scene beyond the physical set on stage. It makes the show feel bigger than it is. On top of that, the screens also provide the illusion of movement in the sequences involving the DeLorean. While the DeLorean is a physical prop that moves on stage, it obviously isn't actually moving at 88 miles per hour. Instead, the DeLorean drives around, turns, and spins on stage while the screen behind it projects the background moving quickly, and the screens in front project the fire and electricity. It all comes together to create a very impressive show right before your eyes. Another good example of the screens expanding the scene is when Doc must reach the top of the clock tower to repair the cable during the finale. The set designers and creatives behind the musicals said that they initially struggled with how to build a staircase or something for Doc to climb up to the top. Instead, Doc just runs in place while the screens project a staircase. It's a very funny moment that got a big chuckle out of the entire crowd. On top of that, while Doc is standing on a practical clock tower set, the screen in front of him projects rain, wind, and lightning, adding to the immersion like the DeLorean. Now, the screens are by no means perfect. There have been times where the show has to actually pause due to an error with the screens. Because the climax is supported by the screens, they have to stop the show and put up this funny little screen while they troubleshoot the issue. I acknowledge I say funny little screen, but it's probably not actually funny if you're sitting in that audience when it happens. That being said, I think the screens are well utilized as the support set they are. Think of it similar to the volume in modern day Hollywood. The volume is a background which projects outdoor images and is supposed to simulate a set or an outdoor setting. When used solely as your setting, it looks terrible. But when it's used as additional lighting or in the background, it enhances the scene. And that's exactly what this does. Rather than being used to replace physical sets, the screens instead expand and improve the sequences where they are used. Speaking of those sets, they are incredibly impressive as well. Personally, the 3 musicals I have experience with are Hamilton, Wicked, and The Lightning Thief. All 3 of these shows use very limited to no backdrops at all, instead relying on props to show a location. So imagine my surprise when Back to the Future wheeled out Doc Brown's entire house, the McFly kitchen, and Lou's Cafe just in Act 1. These are massive and impressive backdrops that come and go seamlessly throughout the show as characters move from scene to scene. It really gives the viewer a clear sense of where they are. The sheer size of them also gives plenty of room to show off the choreography on stage, like in Something About That Boy, where the characters are running and climbing on various set pieces and jumping from piece to piece as they're being dragged away to be replaced with the next set. Between the screens in these sets, it's no surprise the musical was nominated for Best Scenic Design of a Musical at the 2024 Tony Awards. Of course, I've already mentioned it a few times in this video, but there is no Back to the Future without the DeLorean. And it is wickedly impressive in this show. Throughout the show, there are at least 2 DeLoreans used. While the one on tour might be slightly smaller, the ones used on Broadway are full-sized cars. Having a full-sized car on stage is very impressive and makes the scenes more tangible. You don't have to suspend your disbelief because the car is actually right there in front of you. One of the DeLoreans used on stage can actually drive and maneuver around the stage, which is used for the 88 mph sequences. It's especially impressive in the climax when Marty is driving through town and the car turns and spins with assistance of the turntable on stage. The second car, even more impressively, is used in the finale when Doc and Marty fly off into the future. And yes, they do in fact fly the car. Imagine the look on my face when instead of the curtain closing or the flying car being a projection on one of the screens, the DeLorean, with the actors inside, took flight and flew over the first few rows of the audience, with the actors waving and acknowledging crowd members below, proving that they're actually in the car. It truly is an impressive and immersive effect that I'm not totally sure how they pull off. The show has been keeping this pretty secretive to avoid spoilers, as well as just not wanting to blow how you pull off the magic. My current theory is it's either crazy strong wires or a forklift type mechanism below the stage that isn't visible when the lights are dimmed during this sequence. All that being said, the DeLorean is the crowning achievement of the set and prop design of the show. Having something so tangible and real in front of you is an amazingly unique experience to stage show. Something you couldn't really feel in a movie. Just ask Christopher Lloyd.
The DeLorean is such an integral part of the story. It's like a character itself. What they do with the DeLorean is unreal. The way they've recreated it in actual DeLorean in many different ways is just as exciting as in the movie. Maybe even more so because it's right there. The reality of it is right in your face.
Speaking of Lloyd, at 85 and 63 years old respectively, Lloyd and Michael J. Fox couldn't possibly play these roles in the musical. Of course, their performances are timeless and could never be replaced. Hence why Zemeckis and Gale said they would never do a fourth film without them. However, on the stage is something different, and the keys have both been metaphorically and literally passed to the new generation.
He'll do.
The writing is consistent with these characters, and all who play them perfectly capture the original characters, with maybe some new twist. So that's Back to the Future the musical. My friends and I took a long road trip to see the North American tour in Cleveland. We had such a great time and nothing went wrong during our show. Or if it did, it wasn't noticeable. It was like experiencing the movie for the first time again. By the end, they of course had a big round of applause and standing ovation to the entire cast and crew from the entire auditorium.
I gotta tell you, it was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
I give a big round of applause and standing ovation to the entire cast and crew who put everything together.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
As I said at the beginning of this video, I think the first movie has a perfect script and screenplay. You would be a fool to think you could reboot or remake that original film. Hence why Zemeckis hasn't given his blessing to anything like that. Luckily for Bob Gale, he set out to do something new with the story that they had told together almost 40 years ago. This is an adaptation for a new medium. It introduces the story to a new audience and tells it in a different and unique way that couldn't be replicated on the big screen, but it doesn't replace the original film. And that's why this adaptation is currently and should remain as the only reboot of Back to the Future.